The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept it, and hold it. May we realize the true mind, the Tathagata, which is not such an easy thing to do. Yet we have the capacity to do so. Today is the 5th day of this 7-day sesshin here in February 2023 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I learned recently of an incident in the life of someone related to us that really expresses what goes on for most people coming to Zen practice. Most people in life, even most people not coming to Zen practice. This world that we live in is so full of judgment, so full of harshness, so full of violence, so full of difficulty. This is what is known as the Saha world, because it is characterized by those situations, events, experiences. There's no one here in this Zendo who hasn't had a life that was in which there was no war anywhere in the world. No one here, even in recent years, has had a life in which there's been no news of violence, not necessarily to ourselves, but to other people, sometimes people we know or knew. It's quite a challenging time to be living. And yet we come to life yearning to be free, yearning to open to what we sense is a deeper way of being. And that yearning is accurate. And we can realize that deeper way of being, who we really are, that face before our parents were born, that is still alive and functioning now. It's only hidden underneath assumptions, ideas, experiences, conditioning, in a word. All the way back millennia, multi-millennia ago, even since time immemorial, people have become conditioned. It's an integral part of life, and it has an important role. If we didn't draw back when we touched fire, we wouldn't survive. So there is that good part about it. However, there's another part that is a serious source of pain and suffering. And this incident that happened to one person's life very recently is a real metaphor for that. The person's house is 100% electric. There's no gas appliances anywhere in the house. But there is apparently at least one carbon monoxide warning. And the problem is that there's nothing in the house that can provide or produce carbon monoxide. So when this carbon monoxide detector went off, of course, it caused a great deal of alarm and puzzlement, of course, as well. This is, like I said, a metaphor for each one of us. We have experiences growing up. I'm gonna need a sneeze. Excuse me. And some of these experiences are positive and some of them are negative. Some of them are profoundly negatively impactful. There is a list. Last I noticed it, it was something like 7 different experiences that are considered to be adverse childhood experiences. And at the top of the list is abandonment. Abandonment can come in many forms, and it's not necessarily anyone's fault. As you've heard in previous teishos, sometimes a mother dies in childbirth. Sometimes there's a death, an accident. I mentioned President Biden's two sons, who were toddlers at the time. There was a car accident in which their mother and their baby sister were both killed. When a child is a toddler, in particular, abandonment can be impactful. It actually impacts the development of the brain, which is not necessarily something that can't be overcome, but it does have that impact initially, at least. And of course, there are many other sources of childhood adverse experiences. And when we have an experience that is in that list, then it impacts the rest of our life until we can somehow work with it and process the results of it, the conditioning that takes place around it, the assumptions we make of ourselves. Until we can do that, we are caught. We can excel in everything that society values, but there is still a hollowness inside us. And that hollowness drives us in many painful ways. It's like that carbon monoxide detector going off, even though there is no current reason for any warning because there's no carbon monoxide. When we get conditioning, various different situations trigger that conditioning. And often, if that conditioning is strong enough, that alarm is going on constantly in the background, all the time. There are several of us here for whom that is the case. And as I said, it drives us. It's a cause of tremendous suffering. If we're fortunate to have someone in our life who was there for us in a positive way, in a nurturing way, that tends to mitigate to a certain degree the effect of whatever that adverse childhood experience is. But there's still, until it's worked through, and it usually takes a long time for that to happen. It certainly took a long, long time in my own life. But it can happen. Until then, it drives us. It causes us untold anguish. When Eugene Gendlin, who was actually a philosopher, but ended up working in psychology far more than he worked in philosophy, was in graduate school, he was working with a rather well-known psychologist, Carl Rogers. And they set out to try to find out what difference, if there was one, made a positive difference in moving forward in psychotherapy. And what was the difference between a person who was able to move forward and one who stayed kind of running in place, more or less, for even decades of psychotherapy. And they very quickly found out, as most of you already know, what made the difference. And that was that the ones who were able to move forward rapidly could turn their attention within and focus on what their bodies were feeling when they were in therapy. That can be expanded to daily life, and that was the miracle took place for me. When that book came out called Focusing, which was the result of that study, and a writing that Eugene gave about how to work with bringing your mind to that level of focusing, which he called focusing on the felt sense. It made all the difference in the world for me. That book is still available, and as many of you know, we give copies of it out to our Regaining Balance women veterans with PTSD attendants. And because it was so positive an experience for me, it has been shown to help many, many people. I don't think it would be still in print if it wasn't effective. There's also a workbook that goes with it nowadays. But if you choose to get the book and start working through it, know that it can be a challenge. For some people, it can sit on their bookshelf for years, literally, before they dare to take it off the bookshelf and begin to read it. And even then, it can seem so dense because of the conditioning that it's not helpful initially. It can take years and years and years, as it did for me, to be able to master the way of working with the felt sense, even though inherently I was intuitive. But it is worth it. Not to have that carbon monoxide alarm going off sporadically or constantly in the back of your mind can relieve a tremendous amount of stress for you, change your life radically. The challenge is that often, particularly if one has had the abandonment adverse childhood experience, which was what happened to me, takes place in an ongoing manner, as it did for me. There was never any resolution to that with regard to the person that was the cause of it. And so we're left to our own resources. But we can, I know, because I've done it, work through these things. And the biggest challenge is to be willing to walk into the pain. And as part of that, we can't do it initially. We have to keep trying. Not only that, but we may get into the edge of the pain, dip our toes into the water a bit, but there are layers and layers and layers of that pain. Yet each layer begs to be worked through, and can be worked through. It's classically known these days that people who have been traumatized in one way or another and having a certain number of these ACES, as they're known as, adverse childhood experiences, predisposes one to seeking spiritual help. After all, if our life was fine and dandy, if everything was easy and we felt fulfilled, what point in seeking for something deeper? But when we have not had that happen to us, when our life has been characterized by, as one person put it, feeling locked out of the universe, then it's important to begin this work, particularly when we are drawn to spiritual practice, because it will raise its head during our zazen, if we're doing zazen, if we're drawn to Zen practice, It'll also raise its head regardless of whether we're drawn to Zen practice or not. It drives our behavior no matter what until it is released from our body. And release means walking in and allowing oneself to open to a kind of radical acceptance of the challenging energies that are flying around our bodies. And there are usually layers of them. What initially seems to be grief is often underpinned by other feelings, including rage. And of course, in our society, for women at least, women aren't supposed to get angry. So often we will cry instead. That's a more acceptable way of expressing discomfort. We don't need to be prisoner of this. But in order not to be, we have to sort of take a deep breath over and over and over again and walk into the pain, not the idea of the pain, not the story of the history of it. Those are stories, and they do not reach the part that's captured in our body that continues the pain coming. As we extend the out-breath, which is a profound practice in Zen practice and Rinzai Zen practice, when we find we cannot extend it very far, that's an opportunity to tune in right there at wherever part it stops and just stay present with that sense in our body, even if it is a sense of blankness. It doesn't have to be a particular sense. It doesn't have to be identified as anger or grief or whatever. We're not looking for that. What we're looking for is an openness to feeling the experience of the energy flowing or not flowing, or jumping around, or whatever it is doing in our body. When that discomfort comes up, when we can't breathe out very far. And we keep going there. And at some point, that log jam will break and we'll be able to go a little farther. It can be really challenging. And the payload of pain and suffering and anguish, really, can come up at that point when the logjam breaks. So that's when you get your surfboard out and you surf those giant waves. And you seek the help of a therapist who's trained in working with traumatized people, particularly someone who's been traumatized by adverse childhood experiences. As you do that, as happened for me, your practice in the Zendo will go deeper. As you gradually winnow out those experiences, the residue of those experiences is really what it is. The experiences are long gone, but the energy that came forth when they happened is still trapped in our bodies until we do something about it. But we can. Yesterday, you heard Bodaiko speak about loving kindness meditation, the loving kindness meditation itself, how to do it, and so on. This is also a signal, too. I have had students who it took 2 or 3 years before they could even begin to offer intentions of loving kindness towards themselves, because one of the major side effects of experience something adverse in our childhood is we assume that we're experiencing it because we're bad, we're not lovable, something's wrong with us, we're evil, we should not belong to this universe, we should be shut out. But that's not true. That's only a conclusion a child comes to, because what else can they believe? Their caregivers are essential. And they have faith that these caregivers, even as they are not necessarily behaving in ways that are really caregiving, are trying to do so. I had a student in California who was verbally and physically abused by both his parents growing up. And when the topic came up, he said, "Oh no, that was because they loved me. That was a sign that they loved me, that they hit me." Eventually, he came to realize that that was not really the case, that his parents were troubled. They actually ended up, both of them, going to federal prison for transporting drugs up from Mexico and being involved in drugs themselves. And when the student was 17 years old, that's when they went to prison. And he himself had gotten into drugs, understandably, from a much earlier age, and managed to cold turkey him off of drugs at that point. He had a pure heart. He had what sounds very much to me like a genuine teisho when he was a small child, which gave him the support, the inner support, to survive that physical and verbal abuse. And we witnessed it ourselves because his father did some work there in California. And there were people in the Sangha who refused to be in the area when he and his father were working on doing some repairs because the abuse was ongoing. It was dreadful. Eventually, through his practice, he changed. It was wonderful to see. When he first came to the center there were two people who said, either he gets kicked out or we quit. And actually, none of that happened. I was able to explain his background, and these two people were open enough to accept the possibility that maybe he could change and to understand why he was sounding as rough and as negative as he was when he first came. He transformed over the years. And when he died rather early, he was, I don't think he was 50, I think he was 49. When he died of a massive heart attack, he had been a long-time smoker and was morbidly obese. Barriers against the pain and suffering. And so one night he died of a heart attack. And his aunt said to me, coming here to the center, he became the man he always was. Meaning compassionate, warm-hearted, generous, kind. That's not how he appeared to be when he first arrived. And that appearance was because he felt so negative about himself. He began to gradually change and eventually became free of that history and the residue of what was going on for him in his body. Although he was never able really to work on the weight, he did quit smoking. Each of us can follow that model. And I really hope and pray that we do, because I see the wonderful being that each one of you are. I see that, and I also see the overlay of pain as a result of experiences. And I see that it is a very, very difficult and long time process to be able to become free of that. And not everybody is able to manage that. But I've known enough people who have, including myself, to say it is definitely possible. It takes work. The Zazen helps a great deal because it begins to uncover where we're caught and gives us the opportunity then to work with it. Most of us have that pain driving us out in life and reacting, projecting, transferring our feelings about one person to another person, projecting our own negative self-image on somebody else. And the result for many people is pain. Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva who became transformed into Kuan Yin, was so struck by the pain and suffering in the world, and the feeling that is so challenging to be able to help all of these suffering people, that his head split into multiple heads. This is why you see traditional statues of Avalokiteshvara with multiple heads, 7, 9, 11, 13 heads, each in an attempt to be able to help more. The thousand-armed Kuan Yin, each hand holding a different instrument so that she can offer in the most appropriate way to each painful person help to relieve that pain. These are the images that we have in Zen. And each one of us has that within ourselves. Everyone here is a bodhisattva. Everyone here has that heart of compassion. Everyone here is imbued with innate wisdom. And everyone here is here because we have a sense that there is something like that just barely out of reach. And if we work hard enough, we can uncover it. But if there are any smoke alarms, any gas alarms operating in the background of our minds, it's essential to work on that, because we can't become partly free. It's impossible. We cannot shut down part of our mind and have the other part of the mind open up into the joy, the expression of compassion and wisdom that naturally comes forth with awakening. It is impossible. I know this from my own experience. So what I have to say is, everyone, to take heart, because it is possible to become free. And it is possible that in coming to that freedom, the compassion that comes forth as a result of that brings one to do whatever we can to relieve the suffering of other people, because we know intimately what it feels like, and we know intimately that it can be relieved. We can become free of it. Awakening has a joyous experience. And that joyous experience is because of the release of conditioning, at least temporarily. Suddenly, with that deep enough insight, we are able to see who we really are, to see life as it really is, without that heavy armor of conditioning. That is the promise of Zazen. But in order to get there, we really have to work with the conditioning. There's no way around it. Those people who have forced a Kensho without working on the conditioning and without doing the long maturation work that is essential, even before a Kensho takes place, have continued to cause pain and suffering in their own lives and the lives of others. What we have the potential for here, and in our life in general, is to become 100% free of that conditioning. Of course, when that comes up, you're not going to walk out in front of a big truck racing down the highway. Of course, you're not going to stick your hand in fire. Because underneath the conditioning is an innate wisdom that manifests as we begin to relieve the conditioning and see, experience life without the full load, at least. So let me end this teisho by quoting the words of Wang Po, also known in Japanese as Obaku, the Zen master who was the teacher of Rinzai. And hopefully I will be able to read this. All Buddhas and all ordinary beings are nothing but the one mind. This mind is beginningless and endless, unborn and indestructible. It has no color or shape, neither exists nor doesn't exist, isn't old or young, long or short, large or small, since it transcends all measures, limits, names, and comparison. It is what you see in front of you. Start to think about it, and immediately you're mistaken. It is like the boundless void which can't be fathomed or measured. The one mind is the Buddha, and there is no distinction between Buddha and ordinary beings, except that ordinary beings are attached to forms and thus seek for Buddhahood outside themselves. But this very seeking, they lose it, since they are using Buddha to seek for Buddha, using mind to seek for mind. So the way to find it, the way to open to it, is through opening to the inner energy in our body with an openness to possibility, that awareness of this one mind that we are, that we all are, that we can't not be, will begin to be revealed. This is your face before your parents were born. This is the sound of one hand. This is Mu. This is who you really are. The conditioning is an overlayment. hope and pray that you work for it, its release, to be free of it for however long it takes. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.